Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. This time around, we are looking into the land of potatoes, tractors, and state-controlled everything. Belarus. A place where the economy is as mysterious as the president's real approval ratings. And speaking of, we're about to witness another round of Belarusian elections. And trust me, I couldn't stress the quotation marks connected to the word elections in that one enough. Maybe that's because Alexander Lukashenko calls it my yearly performance review, written by me. Or maybe it's because we've been paying attention to the situation in Belarus for years already. So, without further ado, let's take a closer look at our latest report to find out more.
Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, the exiled leader of the Belarusian opposition, has advised citizens to refrain from protesting during the upcoming presidential elections, warning that it is too risky to challenge what is expected to be a routine victory for President Alexander Lukashenko.
We can't allow protests at the moment because for 4 years, people experienced such a brutal repressions in Belarus that haven't stopped for a day, and I think that it might be sacrifices in vain.
Tsikhanouskaya, who ran against Lukashenko in 2020 and subsequently fled the country after a brutal crackdown on protests, had said any protest could lead to further violent repression. Belarusian authorities have promised increased security ahead of the elections, with the Interior Ministry conducting drills to prevent any form of unrest. During the violent repression of the 2020 protests, over 30,000 people were detained. Lukashenko, who has ruled Belarus since 1994, is seeking a 7th term in the January 26 election, despite widespread accusations of electoral fraud and human rights violations.
And now, as always, let us explore the issue in greater detail. Now, before we get back to the pre-election madness, let's talk about something truly wild happening in Belarus, and it pertains to the economy. A new exchange rate mechanism has been introduced, and it's making less sense than a Hollywood reboot no one asked for. Recently, Belarusian government decided to adopt a dual currency exchange rate system, effectively saying, why have one confusing exchange rate when you can have two? Now, here is how it works, or at least how they claim it works. There is the official exchange rate, which is essentially the Potemkin village of numbers. It looks good on paper, but completely disconnected from reality. And then there is the market rate, which is about as stable as a seesaw in a hurricane. Because if you're a government official or a state-owned company, congrats, you get the discounted VIP rate. But if you're a regular Belarusian citizen trying to buy euros or dollars, then well, good luck with that, because you're paying through the nose at the market rate. This system has been called a tool to stabilize the economy. And sure, if by stabilize you mean artificially propping up state finances while everyone else struggles to keep up, then yeah, nailed it. But the truth is, this move is less about stabilizing the economy and more about staving off collapse. Sanctions have choked Belarusian trade, and their reliance on Russia means Lukashenko is essentially Vladimir Putin's unpaid intern. Speaking of unpaid labor, the Belarusian police are also gearing up for their annual tradition, stomping out democracy. With elections approaching, police forces have been conducting anti-protest drills to prepare for what they call possible unrest. Now, let's take a closer look at these drills. State TV recently aired footage of riot police practicing crowd control using water cannons and perfecting their drag and arrest technique. The drills even included scenarios where officers confront aggressive protesters. But let's be honest, in Belarus, aggressive protesters is often the code for anyone holding a sign, any sign. Lukashenko's regime justifies these drills by claiming that external forces, read the West, are plotting to destabilize Belarus. And sure, the Belarusian people might have a few grievances, like decades of political repression, economic mismanagement, and a completely rigged election system. And now, as Belarus gears up for another election, the regime is clearly spooked. These drills aren't just about preparing for protests, they're about intimidating people into staying at home. Lukashenko is sending a clear message, and the message is, don't even think about it. But the question is, will that message work? Or have Belarusians finally had enough? And now here to shed more light on this story is Franak Viacorka, advisor to the exiled Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So let's begin with what Lukashenko is planning. Lukashenko is planning for sham elections. Let's say it openly. This is not going to be elections as we know it. It's interesting, however, that he actually will have competitors. Are they real competitors, really? I mean, these are the candidates. What is their function?
Of course, they're not real competitors. They're all members of the fan club of Lukashenko himself, and the only role is to be spoilers, to promote Lukashenko. And even themselves, they don't hide their intentions. They say, I'm here to support Lukashenko. All alternative candidates were not allowed to run. All those who had criminal cases, who live in exile, even for a short time in their life, are not allowed to run. No observers, no even imitation of elections. It looks like rather military operation.
So overall, no surprise results there, no real competition, and all these guys are essentially fakes. They are planted by the regime in order to give it legitimacy. But what matters now is what can be done about this. Previously, when Lukashenko rigged the elections, there were voices of condemnation, but ultimately, not much was done when it comes to Western countries. Do you think this is why Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya said this time around, people, when you see elections being rigged, because of course they will be, don't go out to the streets, because you will fall victim to the state apparatus, you will be arrested, your health and even your life may be in danger. Do you think this is because, well, there is no expectation that the West, that the international public opinion is going to do anything to support potential protests this time around, because they didn't really do that much previously?
First, I will disagree that the European Union and the Western countries didn't do anything. There was a lot of sanctions packages. There were a lot of words of condemnation. Of course, we didn't change the power. Of course, we didn't defeat the dictatorship. But Lukashenko for 5 years did not legitimize himself. He's still the pariah. No one talks to him. And the only his friend is Vladimir Putin. Speaking about Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, she declared that she will not call people to protests on the streets, but to show their protest in other meaningful, safe ways, because there is a huge terror in the country. Every single day, 15, 20 people are being detained, people are tortured, beaten, 7 people died in prison, and we can't afford more victims. We know that there will be a trigger, but this trigger will not be connected to these so-called elections, definitely. We are calling for international community to reject this sham, to not change the policy, not to recognize Lukashenko, continue working with Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, help Ukraine to win this war, and prepare for the real window of opportunity when it opens, and it will definitely open, and we have to bring this moment closer.
So now the question is, when do you think this window may open? Because what we do know is that Lukashenko is increasingly dependent on Vladimir Putin. He, every now and then, he travels to Sochi to have a nice chat with him, treating Putin as if he was a cash machine, because he needs more money for the floundering economy. But also there is the problem of Russian military presence. What would need to happen in order for this window of opportunity to arise?
Several scenarios. First scenario, the victory of Ukraine will weaken Putin, means it will weaken Lukashenko as well. Second, economic situation. This is why it's important to impose sanctions on the vital sectors of state economy of Belarus and Lukashenko's wallets as well. Third, the split of nomenclatura. There are many people inside the regime who support Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya, who wants Belarus to be part of the European world, European family of nations, and who don't understand why we should suffer because of 2 crazy dictators. It could be social unrest. There are so many, it's so fragile, the situation itself, and it's so different from Russia. In Russia, I cannot imagine, the protests because people have these imperial ambitions and feelings. In Belarus, there is no such thing. Belarusians support Ukraine and against the war. So I think that the moment can come from anything. We just must be ready for this moment, and we must help Ukraine to win. It's so important to all of us, because without the victory of Ukraine, without free Ukraine, it will be very, very difficult for us to drag Belarus out of Russian clothes.
So don't you think that the problem really lies with the lack of resolve in the West? I mean, you've mentioned Ukraine needs to win the war in order to weaken Russia, in order to, send ripples across the Russian regime, and then perhaps the iron grip on Belarus could also weaken. But we can see, this is not an indictment of one particular administration. The Biden administration helping Ukraine, but many people say not helping enough. The Trump administration sending mixed signals, saying, okay, we need a ceasefire. This ceasefire may result in Ukrainian land becoming, at least factually, essentially trapped within the Russian territories, right? So international law will not have been complied with. Russia will emerge, at least in propaganda terms. It will emerge as the victor because, they have taken away land. So this does seem like a scenario in which there are not many windows of opportunity because the West doesn't really want to rock the boat too much. Do you think the West, the United States in particular, whether Democrats or Republicans, don't really want Russia to lose? Could that be the problem?
You are very right. There is such feelings, such moods in the West to finish the war by any cost. And to appease Lukashenko, to appease Putin. But dictators cannot be appeased, they cannot be re-educated. I think there is this naivety that you can make a deal with Putin and the war will be over. No, he will take a break and he will attack again. He will attack not only Ukraine or Belarus, he will come to Poland, he will come to Baltic states, he will come to Germany again and again. So if the dictatorship, if Putin will not be defeated, it will rise up again and again with double force. So we hope that US administration and European leadership will be resolute, will be firm, will be consistent in supporting Ukraine, in supporting democratic forces of Belarus and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. This is the battlefield. This is the front line of this fight against tyranny. And we must educate, we must explain the importance of this fight, of our fight, to all democratic countries.
Are you not afraid that any potential ceasefire would also result in a sort of new Iron Curtain descending once again, essentially with Russia demanding, okay, apart from us being allowed to, keep what we have conquered in Ukraine, and Ukraine not joining NATO, at least not for now, we also don't want you to interfere in any countries we consider to be part of our sphere of influence, even if Russia acknowledges that, okay, the Baltic states are off limits, Poland is off limits, but Belarus, they will insist, it's a part of the Russian world. Would that not result in a situation whereby the West would still go through the motions of saying, yes, of course, we do not support Lukashenko, but then again, not doing anything, because Russia would say, you said no meddling. You're not supposed to be helping the opposition to, to launch any sort of revolution there, because that would be breaking our treaty, which Russia would probably break that treaty sooner or later anyway. But before that, it would, of course, accuse the others of doing so.
Gosh, it's our biggest fear that Belarus will be given to Putin as the consolation prize. Even if the war will stop for a moment, Belarus will remain under Russian control with Russian nuclear weapons, Russian troops on our territory, and it will be very, very difficult to get it out of this influence. So we encourage our Western partners to see Belarus as the part of European, Western civilization. Yes, it's under occupation. Yes, it's under tyranny, but it doesn't mean we should not fight for it together, Belarusian people and the democratic countries. So Belarus should be also discussed at the peace talks when they happen, if they happen. We must demand the withdrawal of Russian troops, not only from Ukraine, but also from Belarus, including nuclear weapons. Only this will guarantee peace, long-lasting peace in Europe. And of course, Iron Curtain is not invention of democracies. It's invention of dictatorship like Lukashenko and Putin to isolate their own people. So we shouldn't help them in that. We should take people, bring people closer to Europe, closer to democratic values, allow Belarusians to communicate with democratic world and to bring these values inside the country. Because Russian propaganda is trying to convince people that no one is waiting for you in the West. They do this in Ukraine, they do this in Belarus. No, we must say, we don't want Lukashenko's and Putin's in Europe, but we want your people to be to work with our communities. I think that's very important.
Do you think that Western leaders and societies also fail to understand that this is also an investment in a way, because you have a new democratic partner in the East, Belarus, which would also gradually become a more contemporary free market economy instead of being this sort of leftover from the Soviet system, where Lukashenko is really calling the shots, telling companies what they should do and what they should not. Would you say that there is this, lack of understanding that we're really investing in our future as Europeans there? And this was pointed out recently that, if Ukraine lost the war completely, the German economy would have to pay like 10 or 20 times more than it does supporting Ukraine now for increasing resilience, building more weapons, making sure that NATO obligations are satisfied against, an emboldened Russia, and so on and so on. Do you think that this lack of simple calculation is the most surprising thing? People are not expected always to essentially, to fight for others without personal gain, but there is a personal gain, security and prosperity. Why do you think this is lost on so many in the West?
Of course, you're right. Many people see it as a charity, supporting Ukraine, supporting Belarusian democratic movement, but it's an investment in peace and security. And in long term, it will bring so many benefits, and not just like financial opportunities, but also people who are very well educated, very modern. In Belarus, for example, we have one of the best IT sectors in Europe, which gave so many talented and successful startups and companies to the entire world. And all these brains will be contributing to the democratic civilization, which is super, super important. Unfortunately, there is no understanding. Unfortunately, still in the West, there is perception that, there is the soft power, something like secondary, like supporting like media, civil society. But when we don't do this, if we don't support civil society and societies in general, democracies, then we will spend billions for military expenses. And this is what happened in 2020. The West was hesitant in supporting Belarus. And I remember, President Macron was saying, we have to speak to Putin, what to do with Belarus. But now the West pays billions for military, to defend from Putin. So I think this perception must be changed.
And perhaps this is what Svetlana Tikhanovskaya meant by saying sometimes people in the West need to consider abandoning some of their own comfort, because it's fine living in a comfortable, cozy society, but sometimes you need to make sacrifices, right?
In countries like Poland or Lithuania, everyone understands that. And Poland, for example, understands perfectly the importance of Belarus, geographical, geopolitical, economical. But when you go farther and farther to Spain, Portugal, France, people have to be explained, the importance, the interconnection between this war, Putin's aggression against Ukraine, and between their comfort. Yes, they can have bigger, higher prices for gas for a while. But in the perspective of years, if we defeat Putin, if we stop Lukashenko, there will be huge saving. There will be stable trade, there will be investments, there will be new opportunities. And this, unfortunately, populist rise in Europe, they basically broadcast, this idea. So let's stop supporting Ukraine. It will be a more comfortable life for you. But we must explain, no. For a month or two, more comfortable life. But for a year or 2 years, you can face Russian aggression knocking your doors.
Or at least aggression in the realm of hybrid warfare, the economy. So even if nobody will be paying with their lives for this mistake, it will still be a payment in hard cash, more expensive, more difficult security environment to navigate. And as you're saying, it wouldn't have to be, it didn't have to be like that if Belarus was actually a free country by now. Also, the aggression against Ukraine would have been much more difficult for Vladimir Putin. This is something we, and especially our leaders in the West, should remember. Franak Viacorka was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. Russian forces in Ukraine are suffering unprecedented casualties, with newly recruited soldiers reportedly facing a life expectancy of just 1 month on the front lines. According to some estimates, between 600,000 and 730,000 Russian troops have been killed or wounded since the conflict began.
The brutal reality of the war has resulted in staggering losses for Russia. According to an Estonian military analyst, Artur Rehi, daily casualties in October and November may have exceeded 1,500 soldiers. Ukraine's military estimates that Russia has lost over 735,000 troops since the start of the war in 2022. Despite these heavy losses, however, Russian forces have maintained their offensive in critical regions, especially in the eastern Donetsk region, where they keep moving forward, slowly yet steadily. While Ukrainian strategists focus on inflicting maximum casualties, analysts predict that Russia may suffer further losses, with some estimates suggesting Ukraine could kill or wound up to 300,000 Russian soldiers by the end of 2024. Ukraine's own military losses are also severe, with reports estimating between 60,000 and 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed since the invasion began. And as long as the war continues, there will be more.
Romania's Constitutional Court has ordered a recount of ballots cast in the first round of the presidential election, where far-right independent candidate Călin Georgescu unexpectedly secured nearly 23% of the vote. The court's decision mandates the re-verification and recounting of votes from the election held on the 24th of November, a ruling that the court stated was final.
Romania will recount the ballots from the first round of the presidential election after far-right candidate Călin Georgescu shocked the nation with a surprising lead, setting the stage for a runoff against center-right candidate Elena Lasconi. Georgescu's campaign, which lacked formal party backing, gained significant traction on social media, especially TikTok, where his account amassed 1.6 million likes with videos of his public appearances and personal activities. Following the court's decision, Romania's Supreme National Defense Council revealed it had uncovered evidence of cyber attacks potentially influencing the election's outcome, and suggested TikTok had provided preferential treatment to a certain candidate.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Bye for now.